that okay? Yeah. Great. Both here and online? Online too? Yeah, all good. Great. So tonight, I'm going to continue this theme that I've been using for the last 2 or 3 weeks. Basically, it's called The Mountain and Me, taken from this poem by Li Po. But it's really looking at a wider phenomena, to what extent the natural world, and including the trees, the forests, the rivers, the ocean, wilderness, and then things that aren't so much wilderness but closer to home. But in any event, the natural world in this way as a dharma door, as a pathway to self-cultivation, to awakening. And there's a number of reasons for doing this. One, it figures really prominently in Buddhist literature and descriptions of practice and the spiritual path across traditions. And it continues to be a major gateway for people to reconnect with their essential nature, their true nature. But also it seems to me that it's even more in need now today than perhaps ever in our history, in our time. One, because if indeed it is, and I believe it is, a powerful springboard into deep spiritual understanding and awakening, it is also a diminishing resource. It's a diminishing and quickly disappearing gift that we have. So partly the reason I'm trying to bring them together is by preserving the natural world as much as possible, we are in a way preserving a major dharma door for cultivation. One that is almost, you could say, not just incidentally interesting to the Buddha's life himself, but almost integral and essential. And I want to go into some of that tonight. What's going on with entry into or proximity, or even what I like to call immersion in the natural world? I use this expression from the Tao Te Ching earlier. Fish lose themselves in the water and people lose themselves in the way. This immersion, or losing oneself in the way, is really facilitated by being out in quiet solitude in nature, and even in community in nature if it's done right. What's going on here is somehow it's true that the straight mind is the way place, that the mind ground is the ground and the space, the wherewithal of awakening. Everything is made from this mind alone. Nonetheless, when the mind gets lost, when the mind is confused and covered over, often the natural world is used as like a pivoting point to rediscover the mind. The natural world doesn't awaken necessarily an individual. It's not, in that sense, as important as a sutra, but it can stimulate. It allows someone to break free, to unplug. It can be an inspiration. It's both if you do it correctly, it's a stripping away of a lot of things we acquire and accumulate, and also a stripping down, getting down to the essentials. And it's also for grounding back into earth, air, fire, water, the natural cycles of the day as the sun rises, the sun sets, and to move our rhythms into that natural cycle. Again, it is a conditioned phenomena, but it's a particularly rarefied conditioned phenomenon that's very, quote, I mean, I often sort of a oxymoron to say it's natural, but it is much more natural than the artificial world we create. And so as that, getting grounded in the rhythms of the natural world, watching things come into being, stay for a while, decay and disappear, is one of the practices of Pratyeka Buddhas, watching the rise and fall of conditioned dharmas. So even at that level, one of the sagey levels is devoted exclusively to this deep contemplation in the natural world and using those variations and rhythmic changes of the natural world to see how all conditioned dharmas also come and flow in this way, including dharmas of the mind. And that's a basis for the solitary. He's called the solitary awakened one, or awakened to conditions, Pratyeka Buddha. Also what happens too, you can see this in many of the poets, that the forest, the streams, the ice, the snow, the wind, the clouds, all of these things become, in a sense, their friends, companions in the way. And they are, in a sense, both good advisors, but also not sticky, not forming a relationship that's based on love and desire and attachment. And as such, they can be very pure companions. Many of the sages and poets write about this. I was thinking of Han Shan in particular, but Li Po as others, and American poets talk about taking their friendships, their primary friendships, and close relationships from the natural world. We know, and I mentioned this last week, the Buddha himself, in the story of the Buddha's life, is born under a tree. He has his first deep meditation experience without instructors under the rose apple tree as a very young man. He has his full awakening under the Bodhi tree, and he passes away under the twin sala or shala trees. When he was going through the last stages of his awakening experience, it was outside. He was on a mat of grass beneath this tree, and there he took on and defeated what are considered to be the forces of Mara, the evil one. And then, interestingly, he touched his fingers to the ground. Again, this grounding moment, calling on the earth itself to witness his awakening, which is very interesting. If you call upon the earth itself to witness his awakening. Didn't call upon other beings, didn't call on any of his previous teachers. He was simply alone, but there was something primary or primal, if you will, in the asserting and affirming his awakening experience by connecting to the earth. And then at that moment, it was said that the morning star rising in the east was the sort of graphic moment that he woke to his final understanding or profound enlightenment. You could say, and I think it's theoretically true, that all these events could have happened to the Buddha or a Buddha sitting in a temple. But again, maybe not. And again, we ask ourselves, since it happened in this way, since we know this proximity to trees and nature was integral to the Buddha's own experience, maybe there's something here more than just coincidence. The Buddha, if you look at his life story, leaves the palace. And by the palace is meant basically the whole social, psychological world of home, of settled place, of all the necessities being met, even overmet. And in this way, mirrors sort of most people who are living comfortable lives in the modern world, removed, artificially removed in a constructed world of all the things we take for granted, you know, running water, toilets, shelter from the elements, heat and cold as we wish it with the touch of a finger, refrigerators and freezers for the food, and so on and so forth. All of this is, in a sense, stripped away in the natural world, and we're brought back to the basics of our existence, in a sense, confronting the absolute impermanence of and fragility of this mortal coil, as Shakespeare calls it. And in a sense, I'm not meaning to say these things are bad or indulgences per se. And I myself, and I think all of us, use and enjoy them. But there's a danger in that as well, because we start to think that that is how things really are. And so the actual realities of impermanence and impersonality and the unsatisfactoriness of conditioned existence can easily be put into a dreamlike remove. And then when these things hit us, and sometimes they hit very real for some people, it's a tornado, it's a hurricane, it's a drought. And increasingly we're seeing what we've done to the natural world with our pushing in of our desires and our greed. We're actually deforming it in a way that it's coming back to bring us really face to face with the impermanence and the vicissitudes. Nonetheless, it can be used in this constructive way, even as we're in the process of bringing it in a destructive way. The irony of this is pretty interesting. Anyway, the Buddha leaves the palace, and it says, and again, this is a recurring phrase in the Buddhacharita, he enters the forest. And so his path to awakening starts with this privileged, comfortable position, and then we know he inherently realizes that this comfortable, privileged position is actually artificial. Even though his parents have gone to a great deal of effort, has spent a great deal of effort trying to keep him from breaking out of that bubble, because apparently at the time of his birth, there was a prediction that he would be someone who would leave all this behind for the spiritual path. And so the things that trigger that kind of impulse to spiritually cultivate often are the not heavenly visions, but worldly dispositions or worldly deconstructions. In other words, they're encounters with the world really as it is, not a visionary longing for something that's beyond the world. And so it says he sees, when he goes out each time from the palace on a sojourn, he sees a sick person, he sees someone who's aging, he encounters then a corpse and gets death. Each time he asks his attendant, what's going on here? And the attendant says, this is the nature of things. We're born, we get sick, we age, and we die. And then the fourth encounter he has is a wandering ascetic. And again, this is someone from the forest. So he meets someone coming out of the forest tradition, unencumbered, with few possessions, and something about that fourth encounter frames the other three to say, aha, this is an alternative to those somehow. And so he starts with this kind of seeing things as they are, a disenchantment, and then some aspiration to move beyond the sort of the worldly ambitions and the hollow emptiness of the life of luxury he's born into. And he begins path of renunciation, searching, self-cultivation. He goes from teachers to teacherless, and again ends up deep in the forest under this tree without teachers, finally alone with himself and his own mind. And somehow that situation, having gone through his teachers, having given up everything, sitting there determined to finally tame and subdue his mind and see the depths of the nature of reality, he then has his awakening. And since nobody's there he touches the earth to ask for affirmation or to renounce it. So there's a wonderful passage with, this also comes from the Buddhacharita, and it's very interesting that when he has these encounters, and in some ways what the Dharma is saying, how we respond to the actual encounter with sickness, aging, death, these almost inexorable things of life. When they happen, and how we respond to it basically determines the course of our life and our destiny. And in many cases, it's a denial or avoidance of these, or a pushing them away, hoping to escape or get out of their tide as it's coming. And the Buddha initially, it seems, as Siddhartha was a little bit confused about how his teachers within the palace, and even his own father, wasn't shocked by the realities of this. And he gives this is from Ashvaghosha's Buddhacharita, and you could read this as just a sort of naive, direct statement, or you could read it as something ironic. But here's what it supposedly he said. How strong and powerful must be your mind, he says to his father. And he's responding to the reproaches of the father's counselor who says, stay here, take on the role of the prince, do what you're supposed to do. Maybe when you're old, in your 70s or something, you can go out and cultivate in the forest. But for now, do all these things. And what Siddhartha has seen is, maybe I won't get to where I'm old, because the aging and the sickness and the death thing can happen very quickly, even in one's 20s or even in one's teens. So he says, how strong and powerful must be your mind, Father, that in the fleeting pleasures of the senses you find something substantial. You cling to sense objects among the most frightful of dangers, death, dying, sickness, and so forth, even while you cannot help seeing all creation on its way to death. So he says, as you observe, everything is on this inexorable path going, and you seem to be unfazed by it, Dad. I mean, I don't get it. How is it that you do this? And again, you could see this as, sincere wonder. I see it more as a sort of slightly critical irony. He says, by contrast, I become frightened and greatly alarmed. I become frightened and greatly alarmed when I reflect on the dangers of old age, disease, and death. I can't find peace or contentment or even enjoyment. All of that is out of the question when I look at this really squarely. For it looks to me, and this is a wonderful phrase, it looks to me as if the world is ablaze with an all-consuming fire. This later leads to one of the texts that we might cover on a Friday night here. It's called the Fire Sermon, but it's an actual sutta the Buddha has after his awakening that describes it's called the Fire Sermon because everything is in this blaze of fire. Conditioned dharmas are coming and going through the interchange of the sense organs and so on and so forth. So it's a really powerful metaphor for the fantasy imagined world. So this experience that Siddhartha has, I want to say tonight, I don't think this is unique to Buddhism. I don't even think it's unique to religious encounter. I think it's almost universal. It's built into the human condition. At some point, at some age, through some encounter, we come up against aging, sickness, dying, death. And perhaps, if we're lucky, some vision of an alternative, maybe not the wandering ascetic the Buddha had, but something either external or intrinsic in us that says there is something, there must be something more. And this stirring causes a turning around from away from this path of impermanence, suffering, no self. I don't see how it could not be universal. You see it in literature, in poems, even in the architecture and the stone remnants that are left behind of people in their own way trying to record and make sense of this strange world we're born into, only to have a brief interval between the birth and the death, the entry and the leaving. Most religions arise out of this conundrum. Quite a bit of philosophy is centered around this, from the ancient Greeks into the current. Most of our science is concerned with, in one way or another, addressing and hoping to find some way of either lengthening the interval between, or in the imagined scientific thrust, actually conquering impermanence and death. However, since it's this way, I just wanted to maybe digress a little bit tonight to one particular American that I found some parallels here, and this is with Henry David Thoreau. I'm going to share a little bit about Thoreau tonight. Almost in a parallel way to the Buddha, to Siddhartha, Thoreau comes from this privileged background. He's a graduate of Harvard. He's got basically his life set up in front of him. He's not born to a palace, but he's born to a privilege and prestige and position that allows him to move forward and climb the economic social ladder in America at that time, 1830s, 1840s. And yet, something in him gnaws along these lines, and he longs to see through it. And so what he does, he renounces his conventional success and ambition, even though he's prompted and even pushed into it more, and he goes to the forest, so to speak, similar to what the Buddha does, but he goes to a forest called Walden Pond. And again, he doesn't have any teachers per se, and he begins a path of self-cultivation at this pond in semi-solitude. He's not completely hermetically sealed off. He does have contact back and forth with the small village nearby. People come and go to visit, but essentially he's living in a very simple hut he puts together on this isolated piece of land in Massachusetts, outside of Boston. What's interesting too is, in his own way, he develops a cultivated regimen that's very similar to what was going on in India at the time among the Buddha and followers of the Buddha, or similar cultivated shramanas. And in that sense, he's a vegetarian. He is in a physical daily discipline of taking care of himself. He's celibate in practicing sexual abstinence, and he's living in simplicity and solitude. And in a sense, he's not doing this necessarily to become, how shall I say, at ease immediately. He's doing this because he's trying to become unsettled. It's very interesting. He's intentionally, purposely unsettling his life to have this encountered in an unsettled way, to stir up something that's much more important and that gets covered over it in the settledness. Now, it's interesting that this land that he has was actually given to him by his teacher. It was actually belonged to Ralph Waldo Emerson, and Emerson said, you can go to the woods, and Emerson encouraged him to go to the woods. Because Emerson, in his teachings to Thoreau, Emerson was his mentor, so to speak, Emerson said, people wish to be settled. Only as far as they are unsettled is there any hope for them. And so he's encouraging Thoreau to push against the conventions, to go against the grain, sort of, and go into the woods, retreat into nature, and see what he can discover. Even then, you'd have to think, 1840s in America was not highly civilized. Most of the cities and towns were very rural or semi-urban. There were major cities, but this is really even before the Industrial Revolution. So this is a very idyllic sort of pastoral kind of agricultural society. And even at that, he's feeling the pinch of these comforts in the civilized life. And so he goes into what he says he moved there to live deliberately. Emerson lets him have this little cabin he had purchased earlier. And so he settles there. And this is an interesting, I'm going to read to you from his journal, because it seems to me in a way he's stating something that's universal and timeless about men and women who go into the wilderness to do something intentionally, both to ground themselves and to get unsettled and to rediscover something. And here's his line. I went to the woods because I wished to live deliberately, to front only the essential facts of life. To front means to confront, to look at the essential facts of life and see if I could not learn what it had to teach, and not, when I came to die, discover that I had not lived. This is really a powerful, powerful line. He wanted to confront what he called the facts of life, which is, I would say in many ways, impermanence, the impersonality of things, the emptiness and the hollowness of acquisitions and so forth, again, facing these larger questions. And he wanted to do it so that when he came to die, he did not want to discover that he had not lived fully. In other words, had not lived the examined life. I did not wish to live what was not life. These lines are simple. I did not wish to live what was not life. That to me is extremely modern. And I think it's a malaise that particularly a lot of people could say today. Let's say, but just for a raw example, maybe not, the 1,000 employees that just dropped out of Twitter. People who are pulling out of that, they call the Great Resignation or the Great Renunciation. Now they're not going into the woods and they're not going into the forest, but they are having something gnawing, saying, I wanted to live and I did not want to live that was not life. And this alienation, this disenchantment that sometimes we go to therapists for, in this tradition is actually a good friend. It's an internal good friend reminding us that it's time to move, it's time to change. Nor did I wish to just practice resignation. This is very interesting, renunciation, unless it was quite necessary, he says. I wanted to live deep and suck out all the marrow of life, to live sturdily and Spartan-like as to put to rout all that was not life, to cut a broad swath and shave close, to drive life into a corner and reduce it to its lowest terms, simplest terms. And if it proved to be mean, why then to get the whole and genuine meanness of it, and publish its meanness to the world. Or if it were sublime, to know it by experience, to know it directly. Again, you get this exhortation in the Buddhist text, to know directly for yourself and not secondhand, and to be able to give a true account of it in my next excursion. So this is Thoreau. And I'm just sort of pointing out that I see this parallel between Thoreau and Siddhartha, and I see it in myself. I see it in my own development, and I see it in a lot of people that come to the monastery, that come to Dharma Realm Buddhist University, and who I meet again and again and again. Even when Hung Sure and I were doing the bowing pilgrimage, people would come up and say, I've often longed to do something like what you're doing. Now, the first day they might come out and say, you're really weird, this is really strange, get out of my face. And then often those very same people come back and say, well, I'm really not so different than you. I'm actually spiritual too. I just haven't been able to pull myself away to pursue deeply a spiritual path or spiritual cultivation. And these were not particularly people from any religious background, just ordinary people kind of wondering, what are we to make of this brief interval between coming in and going out? What does it mean to actually live as opposed to just making a living? To live a making, so to speak, to reverse that idea. So for Thoreau, he actually made a very interesting statement I want to quote because it's misquoted often. If I can find it here, let me see. He said, what we called, and this is a misquotement, people quote this as wilderness. It's not wilderness, it's called wildness. He says, what we call wildness is a civilization other than our own. This is really cool. So wildness, not wilderness. By extension, it does mean wilderness, but he's talking about something else here. What we call wildness is not the absence of civilization, but a civilization other than our own. In other words, it's a refining, cultivating space, environment that is different than the constructed one. So it doesn't mean you become savage and animal-like in wildness, but actually discover an intrinsic and refined inner civilization that we would call awakening, Bodhi, the cultivated person. And so he says, what we call wildness is a civilization other than our own. And then his next line, in wildness is the preservation of the world. In other words, what preserves the best in humanity, what preserves the best in our social and natural relationships is proximity to this other civilization that he calls wildness. And so he's focusing on a deep human need for freedom in the beauty and wholeness of the wild. But he doesn't just mean, and this is really pretty clue, it doesn't mean this vast wilderness that John Muir talks about, or we think about as these national parks, for example. They are wildness and they are wilderness. But for Thoreau, it was a state of mind and not necessarily a place. And he felt that you could find this wildness in gardens and parks, in an overgrown backyard, even sitting in a chair in an orchard. It didn't have to be far, far removed, because wildness was a kind of immersion or entangledness in different realities and more of an attitude than an attribute. He felt it was this pervasive condition lurking beneath the surface, especially in the midst of civilization. And it's a creative force. And I think here what we have is something similar to what the Buddha awakened to. When the Buddha awakened, he entered into a new, highly civilized state that ironically, was out in nature and in the forest. And people who encountered the Buddha encountered this really powerfully taming, subduing, opening, unencumbered state of mind that was a kind of wildness, if you want to use that word. So I just want to share this with you. The other thing that's interesting about Thoreau is when he did this, he took books with him into Walden Pond. He was Harvard educated and had at least had French and probably German to read. At this time, Eastern classics were being translated into Western languages by scholars in Europe. And some of the first translations were in French and German, not English. And so what it turns out, and people that did a study of this, and if you read his journal, you realize, and he says this, my best books that I'm reading are not the Western classics, but they're coming from the East Asian. And we know for sure that he was reading the Bhagavad Gita, he had Mencius, he had the Analects, and he had a French translation of the Lotus Sutra. So, although he's quintessentially American in his roots and everything, there's something about these works that both informed and inspired and helped him understand what he was drawn to naturally by going to Walden Pond. I just quote, this is a very interesting quote here. He says, free from the world as the birds in the air, disengaged from every kind of chains. This was his line. Those who practice the yoga, because he was doing yoga practicing there, gather in Brahma the certain fruits of their work. And then he says, depend upon it that rude and careless as I am, this American living in the woods, I would prefer to practice yoga faithfully. This is from his journal. And he says the yogi, the self-cultivator, he's using yogi here as the sagely cultivator. He doesn't mean it literally as just yoga. The yogi, absorbed in contemplation, contributes in his degree to creation. He breathes a divining perfume. He hears wonderful things. Heavenly forms traverse him without tearing him. And united to the nature which is proper to him, he goes and he acts as animating his original nature. To some extent and at rare intervals, I am a yogi. Now, this is Thoreau. So it's just interesting to see these parallels coming up across time, 1840, and I think a similar thing is still going on. So this is just to me really pretty fascinating. Where can I go? There's so much more I wanted to cover, and I hope you didn't find this digression too boring, because it's always fascinated me to feel as if there's something about this teaching about the Buddha Dharma that doesn't have a time or a place or a culture or history, that is timeless and timely and never confined, and it goes deep to the human spirit, deep to the impulses that we all have, regardless of our ethnicity, background, even our education. I see this when I go up in Maine. People who come and they can't explain why they're drawn to the woods or the forest or the ocean, but there's something in them that seeks both to get away and to rediscover, and it's not just tourist. There's something deep, even in little children. I watch the children come, and if they can put down their games and whatnot, getting more and more difficult, they just end up for long periods of time just sitting on rocks looking out at the waves of the lake, or just lying on their back looking up at the clouds. And something is released in that moment, in that proximity, in the womb of, or the lap of nature, if you want to call it, that doesn't have an ism to it, doesn't have an ideology to it. Robert Frost said, you notice it when you watch people that go to the ocean. They go to the ocean, and he says they turn their backs to the land, and they look out at the sea. And he says even though ostensibly the land is more interesting, they just stare out into this empty sea. And he has a reflection of saying, this is an indicative of the contemplative nature of the human, this longing to reunite with a deep spiritual meaning and purpose. And the ocean is sort of like a tableau, or it's like a screen upon which they can observe. And it's his last lines are really wonderful about this poem. He writes about this. He says, they cannot look in far, they cannot look out far, they cannot look in deep. But when was that ever a bar to any watch they keep? And I mean, when did it ever stop people? And I've noticed that, whether it's children, old people, or whatnot, position themselves with their backs to the land and just sort of lose themselves. Even though they bring books and whatnot to read, they lose themselves into this expansive, almost avatamsika-like contemplation. Maybe one Friday night I will share one of Sudhana, the youth good wealth who goes on a spiritual pilgrimage, takes the ocean as one of his good and wise advisors. There's a bhikshu, sea banner, I believe, who lives there, and he goes there as a teacher, and the teacher says to him, my meditation topic, my Bodhi manda, my Chan hall is the ocean. And then he goes through and he describes the ocean, using the ocean as a contemplative focus, for his practice. And it's a beautiful lyrical passage, but it also, again, goes back to this point I'm trying to make of the uses of nature to discover one's own nature. So just a closing thing on this. We talked about the Buddha tree, the Bodhi tree, and it appears as if the Emperor Ashoka also paid homage to the tree. He bowed to the tree somewhere around 259 before the Common Era. I don't know if this story is true. It says he was so inspired by the tree that his queen became jealous, and she cut it down in the night. And then it said, this is the story, the legend, Ashoka prayed to the tree and bathed it in milk, and the tree sprang up within a few days again. And this time he built a 10-foot wall around it. It said that somewhere, around 280 or so BCE, he sent a cutting of the tree to Ceylon, which was Sri Lanka, with a great amount of pomp and circumstance. This is very interesting. I just want to show this, share this with you tonight as a closing thing. This calls from the Kalinga Bodhi Jataka. The Kalinga Bodhi Jataka. It's one of the Jataka stories from the 12 divisions of the canon. And after the Buddha's awakening, he begins again wandering and staying primarily outdoors and living in forests and under trees, but now he's got followers with him as well. And sometime past his awakening in the travels, maybe as he was getting close to the end of his life, Ananda asked the Buddha if a shrine could be built at the Jeta Grove monastery so that people have a place to make offerings while he was gone. Either gone as he was wandering or permanently gone, anticipating this. And as recounted in this Jataka, the Buddha replied that it was not proper to make a body shrine until the Buddha had entered nirvana, nor should anyone make a shrine containing an image. So at this time, the Buddha is saying it's not proper to make a shrine before I'm gone, and it's not even proper to make an image of me, because, and this is an interesting thing, the connection depends on imagination only. The connection depends on imagination only. There's something really interesting about that the connection should be a living, vital presence rather than an imagined, distant presence. And so we know this, that there weren't any images or icons of the Buddha for quite a long time after his passing. And this is by instruction. But, and this is interesting, the Buddha said, anybody want to guess where this is going? Okay, no guess. The great Bodhi tree used by Buddhas is fit for a shrine. Be they alive or be they dead. In other words, if Buddhas are alive or dead, it doesn't matter. The Bodhi tree is fit for a shrine. In other words, he's saying the only shrine that I condone would be a shrine that is a living tree. Not an image, not an icon, not even a stupa. The shrine that's fit for one who is either here, alive, or passed away would simply be the Bodhi tree. And then Ananda says, Sir, while you're away on a pilgrimage, the great monastery of Jeta Grove is without a visible symbol, and the people have no place where they can show their reverence. Ananda said, shall I plant a seed of the great Bodhi tree at the gateway, before the gateway of the Jeta Grove? And the Buddha said, by all means, do so, Ananda. And that shall be, as it were, an abiding place for me. Key line. And that shall be, as it were, an abiding place for me. And so it's really interesting that, again, not only the stages of his life were trees, but even in his leaving, he says to Ananda, the one thing that you can legitimately point to as a place of reverence and reconnection to me, other than your imagination, is a living Bodhi tree. Now, I would say, I'm going to push this a little further and say, if according to the teachings we all are Buddhas and all have the Buddha nature. We're all potential Buddhas. Then I would say, by extension, any tree could be a Bodhi tree. Not just the peepal tree. So it means as if, and I'm pushing this a little bit, if we want to connect with Buddha, we should be trying to find our own trees, so to speak. And by as it were, to use the Buddha's own words, not necessarily to attach to a tree, but to possibly use the forest, the trees, as remembrances of something alive and living and organic that we interact with, and that could be, in a sense, a shrine. So the modern shrine, would be very interesting, would be, and I was giving the start of these talks because of the monks at Redwood Vihara asked me to do something. So Redwood Vihara is in the redwood trees. It's in the Santa Cruz Mountains. And there's hundreds of trees there. I don't know if there's a Bodhi tree yet, but I think from what I'm saying here, it doesn't matter. There are the trees. The trees are somehow, by the Buddha's own words, somehow gateway connectors to both him and ourselves and our true nature. So I would say you have Redwood Vihara, we have Buddha Root Farm, which has all kinds of, again, trees and creeks and streams. We have Snow Mountain up in Washington, and we have places in Canada, all of which are situated amidst trees, which amidst forest, and they're there for all these reasons I mentioned. But again, from the Buddha's own words, you could see that these trees can become, almost in a sense, living Buddhas and Bodhisattvas, both symbolically and perhaps even more directly, as they are interconnected with all the elements. And so it's a really interesting, I don't have time tonight. I wanted to read another passage. Maybe I'll do it next week from the Avatamsaka Sutra that uses an extended metaphor of the tree for not only the Dharma realm, but the whole path of cultivation. So I guess I would maybe stop there for tonight. Yeah, and there's no announcement because tonight everybody's up at Redwood Vihara except me. I'm back in Berkeley here in the other civilization. They're in another civilization there. I'm assuming that the same thing applies, that the schedule tomorrow night will be Avatamsaka lecture with Hung Sure from, not Australia, I think he's traveling. He might be in Singapore or Hong Kong. Where? Where? He's not here. Oh, Jin Fosher will lecture tomorrow night. No, nothing from Hung Sure while he's traveling. Anything else going on here that we should announce? You still have the daily morning recitation, evening recitation online?
Yeah. But there's also on the BBM website, announcement for Emperor Leon's repentance at Gold Sage.
You got to pull that down. I can't understand you.
Emperor Leon's repentance at Gold Sage.
Oh, Gold Sage Monastery in San Jose. Okay, so the BBM website is advertising, but there's a major repentance ceremony coming up called the Emperor Liang's repentance ceremony. It's going to be held at Gold Sage Monastery coming up soon. I know a lot of people who have done this and really speak highly of it. It's powerfully transformative. As I understand it, the Emperor Liang Wudi had commissioned it at the time because his wife had passed away prematurely, had a lot of heavy karma, and returned to him troubled as a snake spirit. And people say, whoa, where are you going with that? I'm just telling you the story. And so begged him to have something done that would transfer merit and energy to help her get out of that woeful state. And that's how he commissioned one of the eminent monks of the time to put together this repentance ceremony, which was performed initially on her behalf, and apparently successful from all reports. And this has now been passed down to us from that time to the present, still being enacted. And I will say repentance and reform is another way, in my thinking, to go into the forest. It's to return to nature. Because what it does, it strips away, it casts off a lot of baggage, it renews and it refreshes, and it actually brings about a whole fresh existence in the same way that a week in deep forest or near the ocean can do. So this integration of repentance and renewal, also with the idea of contemplating in the forest and whatnot, really works. It really works. And it's bowing in repentance is the closest experience I've had to a direct immersion and encounter in nature. It has that quality. So if you have a chance, maybe not this time, but ever get a chance to do one of the formal repentance ceremonies, or even a retreat devoted to that, to the bowing, because there's a day of bowing of the 10,000 Buddhas that takes place every year at the city of 10,000 Buddhas. You will find wildness or another civilization in that Dharma door. It's quite remarkable. In any event, since they're not here tonight, I will try to lead the transference in English.
We'll have class next Friday.
Yeah, that's the other announcement. I'm assuming all of you will get wasted with food and material things and whatnot, and perhaps even family, which may be a mixed blessing on Thursday. And so Friday, you might feel inclined, maybe I should spend some time at the monastery. So Friday night, we'll continue the class here. And it's at night, so you can further outflow into Black Friday if you wish, and buy up a lot of things you don't need and so forth. But we'll continue on Friday night next week. Okay, let's see if we can do the transference. May every living being, our minds as one and radiant with light, share the fruits of peace with hearts of goodness, luminous and bright. If people hear and see how hands and hearts can find in giving unity, may our minds awake to great compassion, wisdom, and to joy. May kindness find reward. May all who sorrow leave their grief and pain. May this boundless light dispel the darkness of our endless night. Because our hearts are one, this world of pain turns into paradise. May all become compassionate and wise. May all become compassionate and wise. Bow in respect to the three jewels.